Alright guys, so you may have remembered a couple weeks ago I did kind of a exercise science video that I kind of just deleted, and part of the reason why I deleted it was beeping, was because I wasn't very organized with it. I didn't like how jumpy it was, and I didn't feel necessarily as solid in the way that I presented the material, so I went ahead and got rid of it and I redid it. So, what we're going to be talking about for this first video, before we get into muscular breakdown and muscular anatomy and all that, is that we're going to start talking about your basic energy systems. And so, as you probably learned in maybe even elementary school, what we tend to work on as far as making our muscles work and actually be able to flow and all that, that's going to be mostly ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. As illustrated up here, we have adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate. And so what happens whenever we move, whenever we do anything, actually just surviving throughout the day, we are basically living off of phosphorus. Okay, as simply put as I possibly can. And so basically there's this kind of ongoing battle to keep your adenosine bonded with 3-phosphorus, and every time that we use it, that adenosine triphosphate becomes adenosine diphosphate because we use one of those phosphates, and then we can't use the other two for reasons. The first energy system that we're going to use, which lasts about 10 to 15 seconds when we start doing any activity, is going to be what's called the creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine energy system. Lasts 10 to 15 seconds, and basically we just have creatine floating around in our body, and it just bonds to phosphorus and carries it around the body, and then our ATP is going to borrow that the phosphate off that creatine, and then the creatine is going to go find more phosphorus later on. So basically that's what this first system is. And so once that runs out, we have to start working with other energy systems. So what we have here is I've actually taken a chart that's usually going to be two separate charts, but it doesn't need to be, to look at both aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis, basically. So basically glycogen is what we do with our sugars that we take into our body that we don't immediately use. And a lot of times the glycogen can be stored in the muscles, it can be stored in the liver, it's found all over your body. But it's not usable in the glycogen phase. So it actually has to go through a little bit of a cycle to convert into glucose. Once it converts into glucose, it's going to be broken down into what's called pyruvic acid, which your fats and proteins are going to do to a certain extent as well. And then it's going to either mix with oxygen or it's not going to mix with oxygen. When it mixes with oxygen, it makes a very clean ATP, CO2, and there'll be a little bit of oxygen left over. And so we know how efficient our body is being and which energy systems that we're using because of the amount of lactic acid buildup, the amount of CO2 that we excrete. What that mixture is going to look like is going to be dependent on what kind of energy system we're using and how quickly we're using that energy. And so, yes, when we look at the way that fats become ATP, what we're going to be doing is the fats are going to have to be broken down into ketones. And so if you guys have done any reading onto the low carb thing, I'm sorry. Not Atkins, the new one, but ketogenic dieting. So anyways, the fats have to be broken into ketones before they can actually be used, and that has to go through what's called the Krebs cycle. Now, all energy systems can go through the Krebs cycle, but it's not always 100% needed. So the ketones are going to go through the Krebs cycle, which is going to take a little bit more time. It's not necessarily efficient, and then that's going to be broken down into ATP. So the thing about fats is, if we can compare carbohydrates to fats, if you were to take, and I don't remember what scientist actually said it this way, but if you were to take and you were to light sugar on fire versus you light fats on fire, the fats are going to remain for much longer time than the sugars are. So it's actually a lot harder, considering that we're using acids, we're using heat in our body and all that to break down these compounds so that we can use them as energy. It's going to be a lot less efficient, even if it were already broken down into ketones, to actually start using that to be be energy. Now, we are always using fats and sugars and phosphocreatine and proteins all day long. But what our body prefers is depending on how quickly it can get energy when it needs it, right? So going down into protein, you know, a lot of times when people think that they're going on to like a low carb or ketogenic diet, they will sometimes really stock up on proteins. But the thing is proteins go through a process called glucogenesis, which basically breaks down those proteins into pyruvic acid and into glucose so that we can actually use it. So basically, in a low carbohydrate environment, we will actually start to use proteins to make up the carbohydrate difference. So there you go. And so proteins will go through glucogenesis, and then that's going to be mixed with the pyruvic acid and O2 and goes through the same process as the sugars went through before. Okay, so when we're going up to this chart, oh yes, this is your phosphocreatine, which is going to be your first energy system, as we already talked about. It's going to last about 10 to 15 seconds, and it's going to taper off and just nosedive. Now, one of the reasons why people a lot of times, well, the real reason why you would be taking creatine for your workouts and whatnot is because it's carrying around that extra phosphorus. So instead of having like that 10 to 15 seconds, it may be up to 15 to 20 seconds of being able to use that energy system before you burn it out. And that is enough time for 1, maybe 2 reps, right? And so, if you're trying to build muscle, if you're trying to get stronger, if you want to have a little bit better endurance, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but 1 rep makes all the difference when you're actually trying to build muscle. So the anaerobic systems are going to be one of the first systems that we're going to be using. So we're going to go through the anaerobic glycolysis, which is going to result in more lactic acid. Now, if we are lifting weights or doing something like that, this is going to be the entire roller coaster right here. It's going to be the phosphocreatine, and it's going to be the anaerobic energy system. And so basically, this is going to last up to about 40-50 seconds, somewhere in that ballpark. So if you think about when you're trying to go for like a 8 rep max and you're really counting, 4 centric eccentrics, 2 seconds concentrics, your set should usually last about 40 to 50 seconds, right? And so we're using up the entire time that we can be using this particular system. And so eventually the aerobic system is going to have to take over, right? And so we have to be more efficient with going through all these. Now these, as you can see, are a little bit color-coded here, right? So your blue is going to be your phosphocreatine, fats are red, and these green colors are your glycogen, and protein is purple. So if I come over here, this is kind of, when you're doing aerobics, I jumped off screen there. I'll go over here. So when you're doing any type of aerobic exercise, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to start off the same way. We're going to start off predominantly anaerobic, and we're going to jump nosedive off with the phosphocreatine as the first thing. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to have our fats come out. And so when we look at like treadmills and other anaerobic or aerobic equipment, they'll talk about the fat burning zone versus the carbohydrate or cardio zone, right? And so here's what they call the fat burning zone. Now, these are all just percentages, kind of. I'm just approximating the percentages of each of the systems. So what you see here is that the fats actually tend to, basically, we can't burn them any faster. Like I just talked about, when we're doing, trying to burn that fat, like literally with fire, it can only burn at such rate, and eventually it just can no longer burn any faster. And so this is one of the reasons why we see some performance decreases when people are on like a ketogenic diet or something along those lines, is that the fats can only produce so much energy at one point in time, and when people get done with those workouts or whatever, they tend to be a lot more tired because they don't have any other systems to pick them up. And also, if you're trying to use just fats, the protein's going to get burned a lot quicker too. Because you don't have the carbohydrates to make up the difference there. So your carbohydrate line here comes, and it takes over when the fats kind of taper off, and then eventually the carbohydrates start to level off as well, right? And then your proteins are going to start to supplement the carbohydrates. So that's one of the reasons why, like, you'll see people who do a lot of long endurance activities, you're going to see, sometimes their muscles are going to become leaner and smaller and smaller and smaller. And part of it is because the body's cannibalizing them. So this is kind of your basic into, and I'm going to say that we're probably about 90-95% accurate as far as everything I've said here. I'm a little bit rusty, so I apologize for that. But generally speaking, this is the basics of how your body is going to be using those energy systems when you're working out. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to move into a little bit of the structural anatomy of every single muscle in your body. All right?